Another draft physics video presentation. Overview, sort of. Just go through the basics, some of the fundamental arguments being made. So, conventional physics has a bunch of elements to their theory. There's no universal theory, no mechanisms that are fundamental or elemental to all of physics. They have a problem between the idea of Einstein's bent space as being an explanation for gravity and quantum mechanics, and the supposition that there exists something called a virtual photon, an invisible kind of photon, that is the carrier of momentum, information between objects. So objects affect each other at a distance, not by something magic, but by exchanging an actual something that travels the distance and sends the message. And my argument would be all it sends is momentum, and through the process of an exchange. So I argue that they should recognize right from the beginning that there's a conflict in this explanation, that both of them can't be the right answer. Bent space moving the same speed as the proposed virtual photon doesn't make any sense. All of these interactions, these invisible interactions, the actions at a distance, science now knows, unlike Newton, that there's something that's causing one thing to impose on another. And the obvious way you would impose is by bumping into it, getting close enough to have an interaction in some form and exchange what is your velocity with the thing that you're interacting with. You're basically imposing your movement on it, and that's the simple mechanism. So I would argue that it's a push universe, that there's no elemental way to describe pull. You just can't come up with some basic, simple mechanism for pull. Pull requires there to be some kind of grabber, and then some kind of, moving in the opposite manner of being hit. Something, it's just totally unintuitive to the idea of a virtual photon, or the idea of transmitting information in this overt way where, it's almost like talking or spitting on people. There's the energy is clearly in one direction, and it's clearly an impact. It's not some message that says come towards me. It's the messages of velocity away, and that's how messages are sent. The implications of them over time can create the illusion of push, but it's just an illusion, because of pull. Because there's really a push from the other side, and so that just seems to be a good, solid starting point, is to recognize that push is the elemental function. It's dirt simple. You just can't come up with anything simpler than banging into something effectively, and there's just no way to do that with an explanation that requires things to move towards something else or be pulled towards them. So you have to start with that beginning as just it's a curious fact. Is that the best? That's the best you can do. To me, it's a significant fact that the distinction, the asymmetry between push and pull, in terms of one being very simple and easy to illustrate, and the other one requiring essentially some sort of magical explanation for where the pull comes from. All right, so the idea is that if you understand that, then you can still, I wrote here ether in motion. If you must believe in an ether, if you must believe that there's only something in the universe, and it's little movements in the something that is the carrier, one little, some water molecule hits another water molecule, is how the message is being sent. then you're stuck with a dilemma that you have to recognize that the pressure is already in the medium. So you have to recognize that the universe is somehow generating this push. That's what gravity is. That's what's holding atoms together. Everything's being held together effectively by the fact that there is a bunch of energy moving in the universe in all directions. And the implication of that is that as every location in space is going to feel the pressure of being bombarded in all directions with an external pressure, a significant pressure. And that if you were to create some mechanism that could block that pressure, just putting two things in the universe, you automatically do it. So if you have a universe of random stuff just moving in directions at the speed of light, and you put two objects in there, there's no way to mathematically prevent the two objects from being pushed into each other, moving into each other, just because they would create shadows to the force on one side and shadow each other. And essentially the shadows would be an indication of an absence of push, equal force from one side and the other side, and it becomes unequal when there's a shadow, and the thing are going to move into the shadows. And as the shadows get darker and darker, they move faster and faster, completely consistent with the inverse square law. So that diagram is solid. Now, it creates problems when you talk about movement and drag, but they can be understood if a person is willing to be patient enough to understand the subtleties of the mechanism and to think about it a little bit. So there really aren't any problems. All right, so as I've pointed out, the speed, the fact that all the forces have the same speed, magnetism, electricity at its purest, gravity, and light, electromagnetic radiation, they all move at the same speed, which indicates they're all the same thing, made out of the same elemental mechanism. And that's just a huge glaring fact. It's just sitting there saying, yes, that's got to be the right answer. Now, the only augmentation I would do to the idea that it's just one force or one elemental substance is that it comes in two varieties. Just to create the to create the mechanism that makes it possible for magnets to have two different poles, for charge to have two distinctly different functional elements. And so all you need is triangles and squares, or red and black, or some stuff that's going up and stuff that's going down, or some kind of inverse relationship between something that's opposite but the same, color but opposite color, so to speak. And you can explain it all through that. So the basic physics is just two kinds of force, two kinds of charged material elements, that is the elements of matter, which are the electron and the proton, and just two kinds of interaction, two opposite interactions to the two kinds of force. And you don't need anything else to explain all the push and pull that exists in all the experimental results. So the basic mechanisms that we, the segregation between charge and gravity, these are the two main players. I would argue that charge is basically what creates magnetism, that the dipoles of magnetism and the dipoles of electricity are the same things, the electron and the proton. So that's basically charge is the two matter bits, and gravity as a force is what happens when you mix the two different things until they look like the same thing. So if you thought of the charges as red and blue, when you mix the red and blue and have purple, then you have gravity. So gravity's the non-polarized absorption of momentum, where charge is the polarized version of absorbing momentum. So one is a segregated or a filtered version of the other. So it's obviously going to be much stronger as a force because it's interacting exclusively in the way the electrons are and protons, their differences are separated, and by separating their differences, the significance of what they're doing is more obvious. In the sense, the obvious difference between red, blue, and purple. All right, anyway. So, two kinds of force, two kinds of matter, two kinds of interaction. That's all you really need to know. And it does answer, it does create mechanisms that make everything else easily understood. All right, so the force, the little stuff moving the speed of light that's filling the universe, if you organize that force, that is, you create a material mechanism, an atom, electrons and protons moving, you can create that force at a frequency, in the sense that you can move something from one position to another position and change what gets reflected off that electron or proton. So if I change their place in space at a regular rate, I will change what the pressure is doing when it's reflecting off of it, in the sense that the pressure, the distances will be shorter, right? I mean, hitting here is going to be shorter than hitting here. It's going to be a difference in time of my reflection, and that is essentially what creates frequency in terms of how the force is reflecting off an object. And by creating frequency, you create the electromagnetic spectrum of force. And just as it's created by very specific kinds of movement, it also generates the same kind of specific movement in matter bits, regular movements that have a consistency to their frequency, in the sense that there'll be rules of harmonics, like this motion will be twice as much as this motion, so both of them will complement each other, because both will allow things to hit the surfaces, or hit the pressure they're moving into at the same time. And so those will be constructive interactions versus non-constructive, versus colliding into each other and neutralizing any of the material differences between them. Okay. Let's see, no force, wave interference, just constructive reconstruction. So without going heavily into the waves, are an emergent function. There's something a group of particles do. It says that group behavior equals wave. Single soldiers don't wave, but a whole bunch of soldiers can create a wave. That's simple idea. And so we see something we are identifying as a wave. It's made out of discrete individual interactions that aren't waves. They're just a mechanical function. And those functions are the ones that can create you can in a sense, when you're dependent on a certain amount of stuff moving at a certain regular interval of time, you can shift the time. You can take things and put them, they can be in alignment, and everything's cool in the sense that they're all hitting something at the same time and maximizing their impact. Or you can take them out of phase, that is, you can misalign them, and now you're not going to have the same impact in terms of the ability to transfer momentum, because the object you're hitting has time to relax, and because it's in pressure, and so you'll lose the effect of, the effects will be different when they're in phase. And so the basic idea is you can break the phase, and then you can reconstruct it. That is, you can put something out of phase, change its alignment, and then if you change it 180 degrees, 360 degrees for sure, then you're back on phase, you're back in alignment. Even though you might be out of sequence, you're still aligned, and the alignment is what creates consequences in the real physical world. So those are the ones we measure and we see. And so there's no real destructive interference, because all you're doing is restoring balance. You're taking two things, something that's been absorbed more energy in this direction than that direction, so it's moving this way, and you can take something doing exactly the opposite, and the two will interact, and the two imbalances will create an equal sign. They'll create one on this side, one on this side, and balance the two, a positive one, a negative one, and it'll become zero again. But you didn't really destroy the energy. You set it free in the sense that you restored it back to the universe. Now the universe itself is back to being balanced. So nothing's really destroyed. You're just taking stuff that is making something move, which means it's absorbed it, it possesses it. It possesses an imbalance. If something's moving relative to you, it means its balance relative to you is different than your balance. And you can restore its balance by imposing the opposite force, a force in the opposite direction. But you won't, and the restoration will give back to the universe energy going in both directions. So that too will restore its balance. All right. What else to say? The key to understanding energy conservation is understanding that energy is exchanged, not merely reflected or absorbed. So we might as well use the the boat analogy. That the electron is really energy trapped, and there's a certain amount of it. That's its mass. And whether we can measure that correctly or not is an open question in my opinion, but regardless, it has a mass of some kind in terms of it has momentum in all directions. The reason why you have a physical surface and a substance is because you basically are fighting the force, the pressure that's coming from the universe, and in the form of gravity, but it's really just the universe, the universal force. And your insides are repelling it in the sense that they're producing a force in the opposite direction, and that's why you have a shape and a form, is because there's a balance at the layer of your skin is where the balance exists between the pressure out and the pressure pushing in. And that's how all things function, and it's the same is true for an electron. An electron is energy trapped, bouncing back and forth. Inside, say, a little can be round, no rule against it. Like a water droplet in space, the energy inside, if I poke it, the energy inside bounces back and forth. I would argue the same thing is happening inside of an electron. And the catch is as that thing starts to move, you can sort of understand that the amount of time the moving bits spend, the amount of time, momentum, or movement inside the water droplet, say if I moved a water droplet through space by poking it, that it would in fact spend more time, the water inside of it, moving in the direction that it's moving, and the bits inside would spend a lot more time moving in that direction than moving in the backward direction, in the reverse direction. And so the thing itself would likely just move through space by moving forward, then stopping, and then moving, and then stopping, and moving, and stopping, because the momentum goes in. The initial momentum is never compensated for. You never undo it. And so that motion is forward. The reflection creates back to zero, now movement. Then it moves, it reflects from that zero, and the reflection from that zero is going to create forward motion again. And so it goes from 0 to 50 miles an hour to 0 to 50 miles an hour based on the fact that the initial momentum went in a direction. And so that's always conserved. Yeah, so there's an analogy of boats and an ocean to make it simple. Then there's these swimmers in the ocean that are moving the speed of light. And when they get in the boat, they replace some other rower. He becomes a swimmer, and the swimmer becomes the new rower. And they row as fast as they were swimming. It's just that when you put a bunch of rowers rowing in different directions, the boat won't go in one direction. It will go in the net direction of all of the energy that the rowers that are in the boat. So depending on which direction they're rowing, which was what direction they were swimming when they hit the boat, and that's essentially the force hitting the electron. And that's the direction the boat's going to go, is the net direction of what force it has interacted with in the last period of time that it takes to replace all the rowers in the boat. And that's all it's doing. So it's making exchanges, not it's substantially absorbing in the sense that the swimmer goes into the boat, but it's absorbing in a without gaining more explicit mass. So when they say something gains mass with velocity, they're really just measuring its mass in the direction it's moving. And what it really means is that it's exchanged mass going in the opposite direction. It doesn't weigh anything going in the opposite direction. Just as a helium balloon rising doesn't weigh on a scale in the opposite direction. You can't weigh it because it doesn't have any mass in the opposite direction that it's moving. So when mass increases, it's not total mass that increases. It's just mass in a direction that increases. All right, so that's enough of that. I can mess with the time dilation. I would just argue that the time dilation hasn't ever been proven as being anything else than a relationship between how fast you're moving an atom and how fast it decays. So the argument would be as if it's a multitasking argument, that when you have velocity, it means you're less likely to be affected by things moving the same direction as you. That would be obvious. It's harder for something to hit me when I'm moving away from it. So there's lots of reasons to understand that any function of the atom that would be dependent on interactions in those directions would reduce its rate of decay. It's less vulnerable to the decay because the circumstance of two things hitting it at the same time in two opposite directions, for example, couldn't happen anymore, or wouldn't happen as regularly, depending on its velocity. So there can be lots of explanations for why. The fact is that when you do throw a wrench into space and it keeps moving, it's fundamentally changed from a wrench you didn't throw. So if I put two wrenches in space and I throw one and I don't throw the other, the two are physically different. The insides of them are arranged differently because of the movement, and it's that change that makes things things like predictable things like the decay rate of an atomic material to change, is because the metabolism, the structure of the atoms, is actually being changed by the motion, and the change delays the processing of decay. And that explanation works. It satisfies the conditions, and you don't need any notion that there's some dimension out there called time that in some way can be manipulated. Time is just a function. It's used up by every time a little bit of the force moves at the speed of light, or every time there's an interaction using those little bits between two things in space. The time it took for all that to happen is used up, and it's quite regular, and there's no past that exists somewhere, and there's no future that exists somewhere. There's no dimension that they exist in. Time isn't a place. It's just a function, and it's a function that can that something can consequentially change how fast it does something, but it changing doesn't change the universe. So the whole idea of these frames where you can have special rules where you're changing the rest of the universe are fundamentally nonsensical. So anyway, I don't want to get into a bunch of that. I'm just saying there are explanations that are perfectly solid, that have to do with solid physics, solid object physics. You don't need to accept that it's that you have to give space, which is supposed to be nothing, all kinds of complex properties to explain physics. There's rational physical explanations that will work and satisfy provide a perfectly satisfactory explanation for all the scientific evidence, all the experiments. All right, so I guess we'll just show this quickly. So this is the simple understanding of the two the two interaction difference that you would the simple point is the blue arrows, okay, the blue bits in the force would reflect straight off of blue objects, like so if the electrons are blue, you can understand that if this blue force hits them, there's a reflection, a little bit of the swimmer going the opposite direction to the swimmer who jumped in. The rower going the opposite direction jumps out, and the new swimmer replaces him rowing in the opposite direction. And so the force can get trapped between two electrons or two protons. So the red force can get trapped between two protons, the blue force can get trapped between two electrons, and the implication of the trap is that it's like two ping pong paddles with a ping pong ball trapped between them that has perpetual motion. And when that would happen, if that could happen, you can clearly understand that the closer you bring the paddles, the more impacts there are with the paddles. The impacts all have the same amount of energy. So if I double the impacts, I double the amount of pressure. And so with every compression, I double the amount of pressure. And clearly that would explain repulsion between charges. And the opposite reaction is that the red force hits the blue force, then the energy, the swimmers, it's like a head-on collision this way. Instead of there being a reflection, the collision results in a bisection of the motion in the second or third dimension. And so that explains the motor force also, because the motor force is essentially, instead of doing this, it does this. And so same difference essentially. And so what it means, though, fundamentally is that if the red force hits a blue object, it leaves in one of the other two dimensions, and the momentum is in one of the other two dimensions. The momentum gained is not away, it's in some perpendicular direction. And likewise, if the blue hits the red, the force leaves perpendicular to the motion of the force, and the motion will also be perpendicular. The component of velocity changed in the electron. And with those simple rules, just that simple diagram, you can explain all the interactions that magnets create and charge creates in electricity. It's all explained by those two simple inverse reactions. The simple difference between reflecting and bisecting in an interaction. That's it. So a very simple, very elemental mechanism, very powerful in explaining exactly why the same charges repel, and repel very strongly the closer you bring them together, and why opposite charges attract, because no force can ever reflect between them. There can't be any pressure building up between them, because everything disappears in terms of reducing the pressure between the two objects. And there's no way for a red force, in some sense, to ever get caught, to even go out of it, except coming in perpendicularly. So the shadow is pretty deep that's created because of the rules of which way and in which dimension the force leaves. So anyway, but you get the idea that obviously if I allow for the ping pong ball to be trapped, I can create more and more pressure just by distance. And if the ball can never get trapped, it's always leaving, then I'm likely to have a strong pressure from the outside pushing in. I'm going to reduce the pressure between the objects. Yeah, so that might be enough for this video. So probably some better graphics and some whatever, can't hurt. There's specific subjects like drag. I've sort of been over, but maybe I will just throw that in to give you an understanding of how the problem of drag is defeated by the elemental mechanisms of electrons and protons. So there's some evidence indicating, some pretty clear evidence indicating that electrons and protons do slow down, that they do drag to a halt. But the idea would be that if you have any mechanism that has any feedback mechanism or rebound, so you can understand that electrons would be connected to protons, and that if I move one, I'm probably going to end up moving the other because there's a balanced force between them. And if I change the distance, I've changed the balance, and the environment is likely to correct for that change. And so the idea would be as if you were to throw energy into something, that this momentum here, okay, is going to make an exchange with this surface, and it's going to exchange this direction, okay, something going this way, essentially, okay, and so this is going to reflect, okay, it's going to look like a reflection, but it's not. it's an exchange, and this surface is now going to have this, and so it's moving, and because it's tied through a force to this other surface, the other surface is also going to be moving, the electron, for example. So if this was the proton, this would be the electron, and this force is going to head towards the electron, but the electron is also moving this way. So as the cart, you could think of it as that moves in this direction, the distance where the back wall of the cart is going to be is now going to change while this is moving. So this surface moves to here, and the back surface moves to here. So obviously this distance is very short, so the amount of time the energy is going this way is going to be much smaller than the amount of time the energy is going this way. So now it's going to reflect off this new surface and go this way, and as this thing is moving, it's, you know, so now it stops, and now it moves this full distance, right? So when it hits this back surface, it makes the same exchange, sends an arrow going this way, and stops this surface, which stops this surface, and now the force will be heading this way, and it'll go the full distance again to hit this surface to cause it to move again. And as it moves, it moves the back end up, and so basically what you end up with is an idea of the force goes in this way, a little bit of force goes back this way, then the force goes from that position this way again, and then it spends a little bit of time going back again, and then it goes forward again. And you can see that's like a frequency or an oscillation, or but the net result is it's going from one momentum that way to 0 to 1 to 0 to 1. It never goes to -1. So the motion will always be in this direction, and the more stuff it hits in this direction, the more that's only going to make these distances more lopsided, which is just going to mean that it spends even more time going forward. So that'll be the compensation, because it's just about these exchanges each time. Anyway, so enough of a video. I don't think any of this, you know, frankly, like I said, can be counter-argued that it fits, it works, it creates. If you go to the website, I have an image of a magnet, and you know, the mixed force goes in and the segregated force comes out. It's the end result of that simple principle of you know, the two kinds of interactions, and it provides the only reasonable explanation of the function of a magnet that's ever been produced. There's no other person or no other explanation that in any way is within the realm of even conceivable. Conventional physics has no rational diagram of the function of a magnet, and dissident explanations are even more they got all kinds of stuff moving parts all over the place. It's just a simple filter. That's all the magnet's doing. It's filtering the force that already exists, gravity. Okay, and that's where the energy comes from. So in both cases, both gravity and magnetism, conventional physics has no explanation for the energy. They don't explain why something moves. No energy is required. They just say it's a spooky action at a distance, that this magical thing happens and the thing moves because the nothing told it to, in the case of bent space. And in magnets, they're claiming a bunch of perpetual energy running around the magnets in directions. There's no evidence of any of that movement, no energy that it's doing any work at all, and that the only thing it's doing is just filtering a force and revealing the fact that electrons and protons are fundamentally different, and creating a dipole, a charged dipole on the atomic level. And when you stack a bunch of those, you get a bigger and bigger magnet. It's that simple. Alright, so till the next time, and such. So, reasonable counter arguments welcome, but no one ever provides one of those. I mean, a counter argument in the sense of any explanation of how pull can be described as an elemental function, how you can have an elemental pull, but you can't. It's impossible to describe one. No counter argument to the simple fact that it would make little sense that if gravity and charge were fundamentally different forces, one being governed by quantum mechanics, the other one's being governed by relativity, that they would end up moving at the same speed. That doesn't pass credulity. And then the fact that their mechanisms do not explain all the experiments, where this simple one does. So make a relevant point if you have a point to make. See if you can actually argue one of the assertions I actually make. For a change. Till the next time, such.